My goal is to try to do several different things at once today, which is always a bad idea in all walks of life, including philosophy, but I'm going to try it anyways. One thing I want to do is transfer our attention from philosophy of mind and external world basis of skepticism, which we've mostly been talking about, to philosophy of language, and see how parallel issues come up in the philosophy of language. So that's one goal, is to just shift the area, but see in some detail what it looks like in philosophy of language. But another thing I want to do today is also start to explore how it is that somebody could think what we saw John McDowell saying at the end of our last class. At the end of that class, we saw McDowell arguing that Cartesian problems about knowledge, this is particularly clear in section 3 of the Introduction to Mind and World, but it's throughout his writing. The Cartesian problems about knowledge, certainty, doubt, are inchoate and inept expressions of a deeper philosophical anxiety, which, when it becomes fully self-conscious, and to borrow a phrase from Wittgenstein, strictly thought through to its end, takes the form of, to borrow a phrase from me, a Kantian skeptical problem. So that's something McDowell thinks, I think. He thinks if you start with a Cartesian problem in some area of philosophy, and you really think through what your commitments are there, it will bottom out into something that then takes the shape of a Kantian problem. That's a big claim. But we might want to see how it is in philosophy of language that might happen, because I think Kripke thinks something like that about philosophy of language, or at least came to, by the time he was finished writing his book, came to start to think something like that. Or at least, if that's too much to say about Kripke, Kripke gives you the materials for drawing such a conclusion. So it'll be an instance of that. We'll look at others in our last couple of classes. But so that's a second thing I'm interested in doing in this class, within the framework of philosophy of language, is exploring the relationship between Cartesian and Kantian skepticism. A third thing I'm interested in today is how a lack of clarity about what our problem is, whether we're putting in a Cartesian or a Kantian frame, itself can lead to confusion. And a fourth topic, which I'm mostly preparing the way for today, but which we'll talk about next time, is what happens when philosophers who are writing about skepticism comment and criticize each other. So next time we'll be looking at Cavell's criticisms of Kripke. And part of what I want to suggest next class, I'll say this right now, take the surprise out of it, what I want to suggest next class is that Cavell and Kripke don't obviously disagree about anything having to do with, well, actually it's very hard to know how to put this. I'll just put it much more cautiously, I'm sorry. It's not clear what Cavell and Kripke disagree about, I'll put it that way. And it's not clear that Cavell and Kripke have the disagreement that Cavell takes himself to have with Kripke. And so this will help bring out how hard it is to just move from one author writing about skepticism to another. That's part of what I want to prepare in our investigation of Kripke today. So I'm doing 4 things today. Now, Kripke's book is kind of a tricky book in ways that matter. This, and his article. There's a book and an article here. I'm trying to talk about both at once. One reason they're tricky is because they're not officially giving you Kripke's views about anything. We'll come back to that in the last quotation on the handout. I'll look more carefully at what he says. But Kripke's official stance is that he's trying to give us Wittgenstein's views. But then he thinks there's various problems about giving us Wittgenstein's views. One of which is that the problem itself has a character where it's not easy to say what the problem is, which he thinks is part of the problem itself, for reasons we'll also look into. Second is Wittgenstein famously said he didn't have any views, which makes it hard to say what his views are if Wittgenstein was right about that. I've sort of simplified a big topic here. But for all of these reasons, Kripke once says that what he's doing is not giving us Kripke's views, and he's not prepared to just say what he's doing is giving us something like Wittgenstein's views. Rather, what he wants to discuss above all is a particular philosophical problem and then a solution he takes himself to be able to find in Wittgenstein's writings, maybe rightly or maybe wrongly. And so what he's giving is Wittgenstein and the problem that Wittgenstein seemed to be making urgent as it struck Kripke when he read Wittgenstein. So that's what we're talking about. It's actually our object of investigation. Hilary Putnam has suggested a name for whose ideas we're discussing then, which is Kripkenstein. And that's the word I will sometimes use today when I'm discussing something that clearly seems to only properly be attributable at most to Kripkenstein, as opposed to either Kripke or Wittgenstein. Why it is that one has to look all the way to Kripkenstein, that is, to a philosopher who in some sense never existed, in order to find what comes to clear expression in Kripke's book about Kripkenstein, is itself, I think, an interesting issue, which we might discuss at the end of today. But before we look at Kripkenstein, it might be a good idea to look for a moment at Wittgenstein, because ostensibly these things come out of Wittgenstein. So that's what I want to do first. On the first page of your handout, I've just given you again an attempt to summarize, by way of a reminder, what one might take to be a kind of Cartesian version of a skeptical problem as it can arise in philosophy of language. Tried to structure this in a way that's obviously parallel to the cases we saw in external world skepticism, other mind skepticism, philosophy of action, and so forth, and then a Kantian variety of the problem, again parallel to the other sorts we've looked at. I won't bother to go through this. I take this to be repetition at this point, but that might be helpful to have on the page as we're looking at these various quotations, first from Wittgenstein and Kripkenstein. Because one question we might have is, what kind of problem is this that's in these quotations? Is it of this sort, or is it of this sort, or neither, or both? It's a question I want to have in your mind. Now, what I've done with these Wittgenstein quotations, there's just 6 here, is almost exclusively, all I've done is given you some of the bits of the text that Kripke fixates on in order to generate his reading of Wittgenstein. So I've purposely, that's one of the reasons I've been scrupulous enough to put a ... before and after my quotations. These passages are just lifted out of Wittgenstein. If you read around the bits I've lifted, then you might start worrying about Kripke's overall interpretation of Wittgenstein. You might in particular start worrying about the supposed skeptical solution he attributes to Wittgenstein. Well, that's what Wittgenstein's after. But my aim today is not Wittgenstein interpretation. I'm not out to convince you he's right or wrong. I'm just interested in the passages out of which he motivates his problem. And those passages are in Wittgenstein. And just sort of get a sense of what kind of issue is going on there. Not worry for the moment about what is Wittgenstein's ultimate response to that issue. But what's the issue that's in these passages? So that's why I'm purposely truncating our look at Wittgenstein here. I said almost exclusively because in quotation 5, I couldn't help giving you a little bit more than Kripke tends to have us attend to, just to give you one example of how if you just read on a little bit in one place, you might start getting very worried about his interpretation. But mostly, as I say, I'm interested in a sense in this particular problem he gets out of Wittgenstein. And what I do want to say about that is that Kripke's right, that Wittgenstein's interested in this problem. I do want to say that. And that might not seem like much of a claim. But actually, in a lot of the secondary literature, after Kripke wrote, at least the secondary literature written by people who are interested in Wittgenstein, a lot of it has the form of their saying, Kripke is completely wrong about Wittgenstein. And they're so concerned to prove he's completely wrong about Wittgenstein, they don't want him to be right about anything. And so in their eagerness to prove he's not right about anything, they don't even want his problem to be a problem Wittgenstein's concerned with. And I think that is, whatever one's reservations might be about Kripke's work, I think that's an overreaction. I think Kripke is doing a pretty lucid job of expounding at least one facet of a problem that comes up in Wittgenstein. What its centrality is, how it relates to other things in Wittgenstein, and what Wittgenstein's response is. Those are all other matters. So let's just look at some quotations where this issue comes up. First quotation from section 85 of the Investigations. He says, "A rule stands there like a signpost." That's a very useful phrase, and it recurs throughout the Investigations. There's many references back to this metaphor of the signpost. Sections 87 all the way through into the 400s and 500s. So it's useful to sort of have this motif of the signpost under control. A rule stands there like a signpost. It's connected to a theme in the Investigations in which the interlocutor says things like, "But the sign itself is dead." I said when the interlocutor says, one thing for those of you who haven't read the Investigations much that you'll discover as you read this book is it's full of voices. The interlocutor is a bit misleading. It suggests there's just two people in conversation. Maybe Wittgenstein and this other guy. I don't think that's right. But there are voices. And and many of the voices are flagged in question marks. In quotation marks, as it were. Make explicit there's a voice here that's insisting on something or saying something in response. And one of these voices, recurrently, especially in the 400s on, says something like, "The sign itself is dead." And that's connected to the thought that's already coming up here for the first time, in the idea that a rule stands there like a signpost. So there's something about the nature of rules that might apparently become clear by just thinking about the even simpler case of a signpost. So we have a signpost. So looks like that. Or if this seems to complicate things, because that involves a word, and understanding words is a further feature of understanding rules over and above understanding signs, then maybe we could simplify our example further and just, have a red sign like this. So this is completely red. And say what I'm trying to do is follow the red trail. Going out for a walk in Bergen. And there's a blue trail and a red trail. I've decided to take the red trail. And occasionally there's a sign like this. I actually believe, if I recall correctly, that, is this right? On the way up to Wittgenstein's hut in Scholden, first you get orange W's, but then at some point you just get some orange signs pointing. So, I'm trying to follow the orange signs up to the hut. So here I am. So it just has a shape, like that. It's a signpost. Now, a signpost in itself is just a physical object, like any other. There isn't, in principle, any contradiction in the idea that you could have a culture, and in that culture, they use signposts, and a signpost with this shape means go that way. There's no logical contradiction. Wittgenstein says a little later in this passage, I think I left it out, but he says a case like this would be a little bit like a case where you had a culture where somebody pointed, and in that culture, people were inclined to follow the line from finger to wrist out over the shoulder. So you point, they look over there. And indeed, anyone who's ever tried to teach a dog to point, to understand pointing, will realize that's not so dumb. If you point, the dog looks up. Usually looks at the finger first, and then he sort of follows the finger up the line. And it's actually a sign of intelligence among dog trainers. It's not the only test, but it's a very good test of the really smart dogs like shepherds and collies, whether you can teach them to understand pointing. It's actually very helpful when you're herding sheep, say, to be able to go, Rover, like that, for him to go after that sheep. But if you go, Rover, and they look at your finger, and they follow your finger up, that's not very helpful. You want some way to... and a lot of dogs can't learn this, some dogs can. But similarly, as with pointing, so with signs. There isn't anything about the physical signpost on this picture of meaning. Remember, we were talking about a gap of something that simply belongs to nature, on the one side of the gap. On the other side of the gap, there's something that we think of as mental or intentional. If we think of the signpost as just part of the material world, and there isn't anything that belongs to it that has meaning built into it. And certainly if you take the signpost apart, and use a microscope and break it into little pieces, you won't find its meaning anywhere inside. It's not, in that sense, a physical property of the signpost. So, with the idea within this picture that a signpost just stands there, is this just this physical object? And with the idea that the signpost just stands there, you might think, what is an understanding? What is it to understand that in order to stay on the orange path, or I guess in this case the pink path? In order to stay on the pink path, I go this way. Well, the very natural thing to think is that understanding involves, borrowing a phrase, two stages. Now we're not talking about Kantian philosophy of perception. We're not talking about McDonald philosophy of action, but I hope you see a structural parallel. It involves two stages. First, there's this stage of, as it were, taking in the physical sign. That itself stands there. It's dead. Then there has to be a second stage. A natural word we might use here, without having gotten very elaborate in our theory about what the second stage involves, is the word interpretation. It's only the sign, qua physical entity, combined with an interpretation that yields an understanding of what we are to do in the light of it. Go this way. So we know to interpret the sign means to follow the arrow this way. There might be another culture in which you have things that look just like this, but if you understand the culture, you go this way. I gave you the example of, people in Greece and the larger erstwhile Ottoman Empire who express no like this, facially or gesturally. A good example of this was came home to me when I was in Scotland a couple of days ago. First morning in the hotel. Hotel was on a big main street. I stepped out and almost got killed. Because I, of course, looked the way I thought you're supposed to. There's a line in the middle of the road. My understanding of these arrangements at some deep, unreflective, visceral level is people are driving on the right side. People are driving on the right side, and there's a thing like this, and there's a crosswalk. That means you look a certain direction to see if a car's coming. In England, everything's set up exactly the same way, except you look in the opposite direction, or you die, or in my case, almost die, your first morning before you realize. Looks the same, only you do everything backwards. Some things are different, like they move the steering wheel over, which is helpful. But if you're just a pedestrian, that clue isn't very salient. So, things could be set up like this, but the significance can be reversed. No contradiction there. So a rule, similarly, to say a rule stands there like a signpost, is to say, I can give you a rule, but any rule I give you, it's the beginning of the problem now, apparently is in no better situation than the signpost itself. This is within the frame of this problem. So say, I tell you, whenever you see a pink sign with a pointing arrow like that, that means go this way. Go in the direction of the pointing arrow. I could write that out. It's a whole lot of words. That's a rule. But now you've got to understand the rule. Any rule comes in the form of a rule formulation. If it's true that any act of understanding involves the object understood as some sort of shapes or sounds or marks or noises in the world, plus an interpretation, then similarly it looks like one ought to have to say or be able to say about our rule. Well, that too is something that's been formulated, but it too could be interpreted in more than one way. So it too must be first interpreted before it itself can guide an interpretation of the signpost. So the rule itself qua object to be understood, stands there like a signpost. Now, one thing you might want to say at this point, I don't have this in the quotations, an idea that Wittgenstein explores quite a bit. It's connected with what some people call Platonism in philosophy of meaning or philosophy of mathematics. One thing you might say is, well, there's some rules which, if you state them, people just understand them. Boom. Those rules somehow, when you state those, there's no problem anymore about misinterpretation. They're just somehow transparent or self-intimating. But one question you might have is, if that's true, why do we wait a while to introduce that idea? Why don't we just somehow say, we could do that already here with the signpost? And how does it work? How do signposts just tell us what they mean? You can see how we have a version here of what McDowell called the myth of the given, or a potential version of what McDowell here called the myth of the given. Not in philosophy of perception now, whereas a mere causal event that was supposed to have sufficient rational structure to be able to justify. That was with respect to how it is that experiences could have content. But here it's a physical entity, which somehow, by merely taking in, is supposed to justify one interpretation rather than another. But in both cases, it can look like you're trying to build into something, which itself, a mere moment or element or transaction in nature, a normative ground for a certain kind of meaning or justification or reason, which it itself cannot deliver. Hence, myth of the given. One wants something to immediately be given. In this case, an object to be interpreted and its interpretation, which itself is not the kind of thing that can be given, or hence that would be the worry on the mythical conception of the given. You had a question?
I'm just wondering about what rules we're thinking about. That's very important.
Well, this is supposed to be, as we'll see in a moment, absolutely general. It doesn't matter what rules we're talking about. The point is that there's a kind of problem. Now, I'm trying to put this carefully. A kind of problem you can get into when you're thinking about rules. I don't mean to suggest that Wittgenstein in the end is endorsing this conception of what the problem is with rules. I'm just not discussing Wittgenstein's view. I'll just tell you not to make a mystery that I don't think that's what he's doing. But he is discussing the problem because he thinks people get into the problem. And if you get into the problem thinking a certain way, it's going to affect all rules, not just some rules. Any rule that involves understanding, any rule that involves correctness or incorrectness, and that's all rules. The question is, isn't it going to be a problem about them? We'll see this more clearly as we go on. So a rule stands there like a signpost. I was trying to show you how much is actually packed into that way of putting it, drawing on other sections without quoting them all. Yes, does the signpost leave no doubt open about the way I have to go? Does the signpost itself somehow make clear which way I have to go? And it's very tempting to say here, no, signpost itself can't do that. Does it show which direction I am to take when I have passed it? Whether along the road or the footpath or cross country. So imagine I come to the signpost. Here's a road. Here's a footpath. That way there's nothing. There's just a field straight across country. I come to it. Does the signpost itself go left on the footpath? Sorry, right on the footpath. Left on the road. Or perpendicular to the axis of the signpost. Straight into the country. Does the signpost itself show which direction I'm supposed to take? Now you could answer yes or no. If you answer yes, and you're in the grip of this worry, then the question arises, but where is it said which way I am to follow it? Whether in the direction of the finger or in the opposite one. So we check this chart. Where does the signpost say, go this way rather than go that way? That seems to be, on this understanding, something more than the signpost. That's an understanding, an interpretation of what the signpost means. And if there were not a single signpost, but a chain of adjacent ones, or of chalk marks on the ground, is there only one way of interpreting? So once we get into this problem, we think the signpost itself is dead. It doesn't mean anything. It's only signpost plus interpretation that yields an understanding of what we are to do such that it could be correct or incorrect. Then, once we have that picture, it's very hard to see what you're going to add that helps. Say you point. Which way do I go here? You point. We always say, okay. But your pointing gesture stands there like a signpost. But now, in virtue of what do I know that I'm supposed to go this way rather than that way? That seems to require a interpretation of the pointing gesture. We'll say, well, okay, let's make it absolutely clear. We don't want this being clear. So let's put up several signposts. Put up another signpost here. It kind of overlaps this one. This one explains that one. This one makes it clear that what this one means is this. We could add these. This clearly isn't going to help if you have a problem here. Multiplying signposts isn't going to be very helpful. Well, we might try, let's put some arrows in the ground. Here, nice magic marker. I could draw pink arrows all the way. Leave out no bits, pink arrows at every step. We still have the same problem. So, and this passage then goes into, I've left it out, but it then goes into an issue of doubt. If you've raised a doubt about whether this is meant rather than that, and you take the doubt to arise in the way I've just described, then how are you going to close off the doubt? So put this way so far, this is just something I want to alert you to, we've got something that has, at least initially, the form of a Cartesian problem. How do I know what is meant? I'm trying to find my way. I take it there is such a thing as a signpost meaning something. But I want to know which way to go. And the skeptical worry, notice, is based on a kind of indistinguishability argument. There could be a tribe in which things looks just like this. There could be a country called England in which the roads, were divided just down the middle and the cars look the same. But everybody does everything in the opposite direction or on the opposite side. So how can I tell? How can I be sure? And again, here, with this Cartesian doubt, as with the other one, they're not denying that probably I should go that way or something like that. The issue isn't, if we're betting money, what would be a good idea? The issue is, in virtue of what does my knowledge consist? How could I know that? Well, it doesn't look like I can know it, except through an interpretation. And then it looks like an argument can come up, which is exactly the same argument we had in the Cartesian case, about perceptions in principle being misleading, but indistinguishable from veridical ones. I could have an interpretation that seems for all the world invited, but it is possible that it's a misinterpretation. If I can't exclude the possibility of misinterpretation, then how could I ever know what the sign means? I might get lucky and follow it out, and it turns out I'm there. More than lucky. But how, in what sense did I know? What would it mean for me to know it? That's a Cartesian issue. But quickly in the investigations, this turns into a worry of a deeper sort. So now, here we had signposts. But the point is not just about signposts, but signs generally. That is, things we take ourselves to be able to understand. Things in the light of which there is a correct and incorrect way of going on, in using the sign again and in acting in accordance with our understanding of the sign. So another simple example is proper names. Maybe the simplest kinds of words. Moses. There's the word Moses. It names somebody. How do I know who it names? Well, I could give an explanation of who Moses names. Quotation 2, 87 of the Investigations. I take Moses to mean the man, if there was such a man, who led the Israelites out of Egypt, whatever he was called then, and whatever he may or may not have done besides. He chooses the example of Moses. It's a good example to choose to get this where you're going. It's not absolutely clear he existed. It's not absolutely clear the text is completely reliable. And you might think, well, there is somebody who was born to Pharaoh, who was very important to help the Israelites. But he didn't lead them out of Egypt. Maybe there was somebody who brought some commandments down. but didn't lead them out. Maybe he led them out of Egypt, but there weren't any commandments. You could really start getting worried, especially if you're not some kind of Christian or Jew, that God actually spoke to him through the burning bush. There's a lot of things that happened to Moses. There seems to be somebody we're talking about. Which descriptions, if you think the meaning of a name depends upon some of these descriptions being true, which descriptions are the ones you mean when you say Moses? Somebody says, well, he wasn't actually a son. He wasn't actually put in a boat on a river. I won't conclude, Moses didn't exist. I'll conclude, well, that's not, what I mean by Moses isn't someone who's put in a river. I mean this other guy, who led people out of Egypt, who I thought was also put on a boat. But his not being put in a boat doesn't keep me from meaning something by Moses. But similar doubts to those about Moses are possible about the words in the explanation. So I say, he's the one who led the Israelites out of Egypt. What do you mean by Israelites? What do you mean by Egypt? Well, by Egypt I mean a country that has these and these borders. Well, actually, it looks like they start over here. That wasn't Egypt according to you. Well, back then they called it. So by Egypt you mean what people called Egypt back then? Or what we call Egypt now? We can go on. But any explanation you give of what you mean by the word depends upon your understanding of the words you use in your explanation of what you mean by the word. Those two have to be interpreted. They can be misinterpreted. There can be more than one way of going on from what seems like what you meant to other cases once complicated factors come up, like the lines have changed or no one was ever put in a boat. Nor would these questions come to an end when we got down to words like red, dark, sweet. But then how does an explanation help me to understand if after all it is not the final one? If for any explanation you can give about what you mean by your words, a question can, at least in principle, always arise. You can always think of a situation in which a question will arise about what you mean by one of the words in the explanation of what you mean by the original word. In that case, the explanation is never completed. So it's never the final one. A further misinterpretation can always arise. And then he says at the end of our quotation, in that case the explanation is never completed. So I still don't understand what he means and never shall. As though an explanation, as it were, hung in the air unless supported by another one. Notice what's happening in the worry here. Initially it looks like, well, we can't be sure what we mean because our explanations could be wrong. But if what it is to understand what we mean is to know our interpretation is right, and the only way to know our interpretation is right is to at least be able to understand what a formulation of the interpretation expresses, and that itself is something that could be misunderstood. If we start to think this through, there's a worry about what it is we even think understanding consists in. If we think what understanding consists in is understanding this in the light of that, where understanding that thing itself raises the same problem, it looks like we're creating a situation in which it looks like our understanding is always incomplete. Our grounds for a belief that we know what something means aren't insufficient, but nothing could count as there being sufficient. This will become clear as we go on. Now let's skip to much later investigations. Wittgenstein gives a mathematical example. Something I think Kripke says about that mathematical example is exactly right, which is that the mathematical example is meant to bring out very perspicuously something that's true about understanding generally. The point being raised here isn't sort of a narrow point in philosophy of mathematics. It's a problem for the philosophy of mathematics too, if you will. But it's just meant to be a perspicuous example of the kind of problem we've already been looking at. I think Kripke's quite right about that. Some defenders of Wittgenstein think somehow he needs to be taken for task for saying that, but I don't see why. So the example is a famous one now, thanks to this passage investigations. We have a student, and we're teaching him the rule add 2. Add 2 is a rule. I write add 2, or I say add 2. And notice we could say now, I'm getting ahead of the passage, but just to make the connection clear, we could say now, that stands there like a signpost. That is, we've said something. The student's supposed to do something now. Now, in virtue of what can we conclude? What the student has done is correct in light of what we told him to do, the rule. Let's say the student is doing really well. We say add 2. Start with 2. I'm going to give you a 2. We give this problem to Kato. I'm giving you 2. Now go to work. I want you to add 2. Here goes Kato. Look at him go. He's good at this. He's doing it really fast. Right? He's firing along. He's going to need a big blackboard for this problem. But imagine we have a really big blackboard. Kato's shooting along, slowing down a bit. His wrist is getting tired, but he's still doing fine. So he's doing great. He's gotten all the way to 1,000. And I'll just let you know, given my understanding of add 2, he's done fine. Notice I stuck these dots in here. I'm kind of cheating, because the whole problem is about what does a dot mean? What is it to convey something by doing a few things and then saying dot. That is really sort of the essence of our problem. But so pretend I've actually filled a board with numbers, not with dots, because that is a profound cheat. And this entire board contains things that you would be willing to call even numbers. All and only the even numbers between 2 and 1,000. Now, of course, what even numbers mean is something else that you'd have to understand. We'll come back to that, but pretend you understand me for now. So that's what we've got. He's gone this far. I'm very much inclined to say, I really, in a way, made him work awfully hard for this reward. I ought to have been able to stop at 18. But I made him go to 1,000. And now I'm inclined to say, Kato really understands the rule add 2. I mean, his performance, I think, is impeccable. I asked him to add 2. It took him a couple hours. He wrote 500 numbers on the board. I like all of them. I really like the order in which he did it. I want to say he understood add 2. And I didn't show him these. I never told him what comes between these two. He did that himself. So if we want to say with Wittgenstein, the child or the student understands the rule when he can go on his own. Looks like Kato's passed the test. He understands the rule add 2. But just as I'm about to stop, Kato, I'm saying, you've done beautifully. Stop. You clearly understand it. He writes that. And that sort of freezes me. So now I'm about to say, please stop, you're tired. Hey, Kato, please stop. You can go, Kato! And off he goes, like this. Now I sort of want to say, Kato, remember? 2, add 2. So, yeah, I went on the same way. That's what I did. Well, no, look. Right? And then there's this bigger gap. I mean, you changed what you were doing. And Kato wants to say, no, I was going on the same way. This is what I was doing from the beginning. I was doing this from the beginning. My understanding of that was such that these are all instances of that. So we say to him, just look at the passage. Look what you've done. He doesn't understand. He says, we say, you were meant to add 2. Look how you began this series. He answers, yes, isn't it right? I thought that was how I was meant to do it. Suppose he pointed to the series and said, but I went on in the same way. If he really thinks that, he's not just mistaken, but he thinks he's going on in the same way, then it would be no use to say, but can't you see, and repeat the old examples and explanations. In such a case, we might say, perhaps, it comes natural to this person to understand our order with our explanations as we should understand the order. Add 2 up to 1,000, 4 up to 2,000. That is, there is a function, to put it in sort of mathematical terms, there is a function such that these are all correct instances of the function. These are the outputs of the function in order. This is a way of going on. What you're doing is, as it were, acting in the light of the demand to, as it were, do that. That's an understanding. A possible understanding, just like the signpost, reading it this way or that way. That's I think, misunderstanding. I want to say, no, I meant this, he misunderstood it. So an initial Cartesian worry is, how do we know when someone says this, that he meant this rather than that? But the deeper Kantian worry comes, we start to focus on the fact that, my God, he went all the way to 1,000. But all of those performances, all of those acts themselves, which in a sense are ultimately just physical marks, are consistent with my understanding of what the rule that stands there like a signpost means, and his understanding of what the rule that stands there like a signpost means. And if you think about it carefully, you'll realize we're not going to solve this problem now by going on further. No matter how long we go on, there's more than one function, different functions, that all of those instances could be correct in the light of an understanding of, and yet what would be the next step would be different. And if you think about the mathematics, in fact, you realize it's more than just more than one function. For any finite number of instances, there's an infinite number of functions, such that everything he's done so far would be correct in the light of any of those infinite possible. You might say, some of them are more like, who would ever ask someone to do something this convoluted? But the question right now we're asking is, what does it mean to say that he's grasped this? If no number of instances show that he's grasped this is correct, what is it to grasp this is correct? What does correctness mean? If up to any point there's an infinite number of things we could mean that would be correct, and we can't tell from the instances themselves which of them we do mean. What does acting correctly in the light of the understanding mean? That's the question that's starting to float up here.
Should we take a break?
Is that time?
7:05.
Boy, I'm not going very fast, am I? Have a break. See you in 10 minutes. When we talked about the very first class, when we talked about the relationship between Cartesian, the first two classes, we talked about the relationship between Cartesian and Kantian philosophy of perception. We said in Cartesian philosophy of perception, the skeptic says, well, it appears to me as if I'm in front of a fireplace. It appears to me as if I'm in a classroom. But how could I know I'm in a classroom? I might be dreaming. And we saw that in the case of the Kantian variety of the skepticism. It became a question, how could I so much as even dream them in front of a fireplace? How could things even seem that way? So there's something that's taken for granted in the Cartesian variant. In this way, that experience can have a content. It can be the kind of thing that's true or false. That things can appear a certain way. So there's a relationship in the Cartesian case between what's going on between me and how things are in the world. In me, I'm having a mental content of the sort in front of a classroom. Jim in front of a classroom. In the world, there's something going on. Maybe Jim in front of a classroom. And there's supposed to be a relationship. A relationship in which the one correctly mirrors or represents, or whatever, the other. And then what happens in the Kantian case is, the problem becomes, how can an experience even do that? And that is generally the character of the relationship between Cartesian varieties and Kantian varieties. In Cartesian skepticism, there is a kind of relation between something on this side of the Cartesian gap, something mental, a perceptual experience, an inner state, being in pain, a meaning, go this way, and something physical, how the world is. how his body is acting, the shape of the sign. And the character of that relation, that there can be such relations, a relation in which my experience appears a certain way, in which someone's behavior appears to be pain behavior, but is he mimicking pain behavior or is he in pain? But that it can be expressive of pain. That it means something, go this way or go that way. Those relations, the possibility of those relations between things on this side of the gap and that side of the gap are taken for granted. The Cartesian question is always, which one's the right one? How do I tell the right one from the wrong one? How do I know that this is a case in which there really is people in the classroom rather than dreaming? How do I know it's a case of really being king instead of pretending and so on? Whereas in each case, in the Kantian case, what happens is that we lose our grip as we think through the Cartesian problematic on how, if the Cartesian has set things up correctly, even before we try to answer him, how there could so much as be such relations. And in the case of the philosophy of language variant we're investigating today, I suggest borrowing a word from Anscombe's translation of Wittgenstein. I propose the word accord. We could use a different word, but I think this is a nice word. Accord. So, there's a sign. Points this way. There's something you could do. Say, walk this way. What to say? That's the correct interpretation. What makes that interpretation correct? Instead of, say, walking that way. We want to say, this behavior accords with the meaning of the sign. That doesn't. I say, slightly more complicated example, add to. That's what I say. This is, something I write or a noise I make. He does something. If he goes 7, 11, asterisk, question mark, dollar sign, I will say, thank you very much. How many years of mathematics did you have? This doesn't quite accord. This is not in accord with my instruction. So the idea there's a performance, and some performances are correct and incorrect. An understanding of a sign, if it has a meaning, should sort performances into those that are correct in the light of it and those that are not. To understand the word red, you have to know how to call red things red and not red things red. There's some kind of accord between a correct use of the sign and the instances in which it's used. Yes?
It's a joke if you use the caps on your tastature on your computer and you press the numbers, you could have those combinations maybe.
Sure, but that would but then my instruction was not add to modulo blah blah blah. It was just add to. But sure, there's all kinds of ways you could get that. Now, the Cartesian wants to know, how do I know which behavior is in accord with the sign? How do I know if the sign means this or that? If we think it through to the Kantian variety of skepticism, what I was calling Kantian variety of skepticism, philosophy of language, what happens is that this relation itself comes to be mysterious. What is accord? How could something be in accord? What is it that we take ourselves to be demanding of the performance, such that we say it's in accord? So, Kanto's gone all the way to 1,000. I said add to, he's gone all the way to 1,000. Looks pretty good to me so far. Then he goes to 1,004. Now I wanted to say, Kanto, add 2. Now, there's one possible case, of course, in which Kanto would go, oh, sorry, I made a mistake. Change this. But if what he says is, this is how it goes on, I went on in the same way, then, quotation 4, how can a rule show me what I have to do at this point? Whatever I do is in some interpretation in accord with the rule. If any number of finite instances is in accord with an infinite number of different interpretations of this, then what does accord mean? What does it mean to say, this accords with the rule? Well, if that just stands there like a signpost, this is just some physical stuff and that's some physical stuff. Is this in accord with that? We need some further, conceptual content here. If I say, I want something that weighs roughly the same amount, if we have some further rule description, then you can say whether that's in accord. But two physical things, it's not clear what it is for them just to be in accord with each other. You can have regularities, but it's not clear how you can have normative accord unless you have some demand for things to be this way rather than that way. So, here's a noise. Here's some noises, or marks and marks. So it looks like, we need an understanding of this. We feel like saying, the understanding in which these words, add to, mean add to. That understanding. But if any performance is consistent with many possible interpretations of that, the sign itself is not, it's only the sign plus the interpretation. And there are multiple interpretations. And we can't tell from the performance itself which of those interpretations you're acting on. Then it looks like things are worse than what this interlocutor says. The interlocutor says, whatever I do is on some interpretation in accord with the rule. The interlocutor's trying to put this in Cartesian way. I might always still be wrong, the Cartesian says, about using the dreaming case. Here too, whatever I do, I might be wrong. It might be a different rule that's right. But Wittgenstein says here, if you have that problem, if you have the Cartesian problem to the max, then that's not really what we should say. Your problem's worse than that. Wittgenstein's not saying, to be clear about this again, he's drawing this conclusion about rules. He's saying, if you draw the conclusion the interlocutor draws, then you should draw an even deeper conclusion. If you have the first problem, then you have this problem. That's not what we ought to say, but rather, any interpretation still hangs in the air along with what it interprets and cannot give it any support. Interpretation by themselves do not determine meaning. This is really just thinking out the point about drawing the arrows in the ground we had at the beginning. If anything I can say at this point involves producing further noises that are only correctly understood in the light of an interpretation, then we've lost our grip on the idea that interpretations determine meaning. Maybe at some point, if I just bully him enough, I can get him to do what I want. But that's true of most animals too, if you have a cow and you say, please go there, cow doesn't understand you. But you kick it in your head and you say, please go there, please go there, go there. Eventually it goes there. Do we want to say, and now the cow understands? So the situation isn't one in which I just make noises and then eventually Kant says, okay. But he's sort of trembling. He's not sure what he's doing, but he's sort of trying to make me happy at each point. But what I want to know is, did he understand the rule? In virtue of what do I say that? Well, I say he's got the correct interpretation. But that interpretation requires what? That he interpret anything we explain the interpretation in front of correctly. That requires what? The correct interpretation. You can see how tempting it is now to want something that somehow interprets itself. As Wittgenstein puts in the Blue Book, we want to say something like, well, grasp the meaning itself is the last interpretation. When we grasp the meaning. But this is a version of a magical solution that comes up all the time in Cartesianism. It's a little bit like saying, the way experiences represent something is their mental substance. That's what mental substance does as opposed to physical substance. That's not very satisfying at this point, once you've got this problem. So then, can whatever I do be brought into accord with the rule? The interlocutor asks, can whatever I do be brought into accord with the rule? He comes back. Let me ask this. What has the expression of a rule, say a signpost, got to do with my actions? What sort of connection is there here? What do we want to mean by accord? What kind of correctness or incorrectness can there be? he's pressing this question. I cut it off here because if we go on, it won't fit Kripke. But we can see how we have a version of Kripke's problem. And then Kripke's favorite passage is the beginning of section 201, which begins the first paragraph of this. So we have an apparent paradox. We think through the problem of what's called rule following in this way. We seem to arrive at a paradoxical conclusion. No course of action could be determined by a rule, because every course of action can be made out to accord with the rule. Actually, however Cato goes on here, I can write a function such that this is correct in the light of that function. But if anything accords with the rule, then nothing does. What is it to say? As I said, it looks like an understanding requires the idea that the rule itself sorts performances into correct ones and incorrect ones in light of an understanding. We can't draw a distinction between correct and incorrect. It's not clear what correct or incorrect means. This is a point. So it'd be neither accord nor conflict here. That's a version of the Kantian problem in philosophy language. It looks like we're losing our grip on what accord could so much as be in this area of philosophy. He puts the point, the next two paragraphs are ones Kripke skips, I think. Basically, he barely mentions them, but I don't think he's anything to say about them. What Wittgenstein's doing here, I think, the next two paragraphs, I'll just say this in passing, it doesn't really matter for today's class, is he's suggesting the problem is with the way we set up the problem. We have to go back to the very beginning, when we said a rule just stands there like a signpost. Understanding requires an interpretation. When he says the way of grasping a rule, there's a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation. He's challenging the assumption which started this whole dialectic. That's not what Kripke does. Kripke assumes that Kripke doesn't see that as an assumption. He sees that as an inevitable step. But quotation 6, I think, does nicely kind of bring out the problem we had at the end of the first paragraph. Quotation 5, where we concluded there would be neither accord nor conflict here. To think one is obeying a rule is not to obey a rule. Hence, it's not possible to obey a rule privately. Otherwise, thinking one was obeying a rule would be the same thing as obeying it. It's not enough to be able to say, look, I think I know what I mean when I say add to. And when I say add to, it means to do this. That's good enough for me. I don't know how I can say whether it's correct or incorrect in some further way. But if I can't distinguish between my merely thinking it's correct and it's being correct, then there isn't anything which is thinking it's correct. To entertain the content that this is correct in light of the rule means this has to mean something. I can't have the mere appearance of this without there being at least a possible case of the reality of it. This point that he's saying in 202 about rules generalizes, I think, if you think it through, for each of the versions of Cartesian skepticism that we've thought about. If nothing counts as my perceiving how things are, if what I perceive is always consistent with things being differently, how things are just happens blankly, beyond what I perceive, then what does it mean for my perception to represent how things are? My perception is just something that presents itself to me a certain way. All perceptions are just things seeming to me a certain way. But if there isn't anything that is things presenting themselves as being a certain way, then what does it mean to say things seem to present themselves as being a certain way? So this is the Wittgenstein which Kripke is working off of. One thing Kripke wants to say off of this is that the so-called private language argument, which is very famous, which happens later in the investigations in sections 243 and following, is really just an application of this. That it doesn't have something to do with sensations, about the inner life. How do I know this is the same sensation again? If there's a problem about how it is I could ever call anything the same again, a fortiori it'll be a problem for sensations. So that, the real private language problem comes up here. And I actually think a lot of problems with Kripke, but I actually think he's right about something there. That lots of people read the private language sections as if there's some special fact about sensation that creates the whole problem. But I think it's an application of a point that's already come earlier. That doesn't mean there isn't things to get clear about sensation talk. But the initial problem that if we can't make sense of how it is that are just being presented with items and saying something about them could license our going on correctly, then it doesn't matter whether the items are inner or outer. Now, Kripke says, let's look at Kripke now. So this is a handout supposed to help with this. In the first quotation, he quotes this first paragraph of section 2:1 about the paradox. And he says what he's doing in his book and his article is trying to develop this in his own way. He says the paradox is perhaps the central problem of the investigations. I personally think that's a bit overstated. But what I think is right is that many problems that come up in the investigations are instances of this problem. It's not just about rule following, as we already saw with the issue about sensation, and that many problems that initially have a different form, like the one back in 84 and 87, but how do we know which way to follow the sign, if thought through, turn into this problem. So I think he's right that it's important. It's not just one more problem. If you get at the right generality and you see it as a thought through version of a less focused worry, then it's quite important. I don't know if that makes it the central problem, but it's a bigger problem than people have thought. Even someone who disputes the conclusions regarding private language and the conclusions in philosophy of mind, mathematics, and logic that Wittgenstein draws from his problem might well regard the problem itself as an important contribution to philosophy. So the thought here is no matter what you think about what Wittgenstein says about the problem, his getting the problem so clearly in view is itself an important contribution. Kripke says it may be regarded as a new form of philosophical skepticism. Now, of course, one thing I want to say about that is no. I like Wittgenstein, fine man. I don't think he should get credit for discovering a new form of philosophical skepticism. I think that's evident in my calling it Kantian skepticism. The form of the problem, I think, is one that's already coming up. Seeing it has a variant in philosophy of language, and seeing how, when you put it clearly in its philosophy of language terms, it has the kind of generality that Wittgenstein thinks it does. That might be a discovery. But the discovery of the bare fact that a skeptical problematic can have this form, I think that begins with Hume and becomes quite clear in Kant. So I think that's to give Wittgenstein a little too much credit there. So this is partly connected to Kripke thinking, I think mistakenly, that the form in which he's put, the particular, as it were, clothing in which this problem is wrapped, namely the philosophy of language one, is somehow special to the kind of skepticism it is. Now, in fairness to Kripke, Kripke sees it's pretty general. He knows it doesn't just have philosophy of language. He sees it's going to affect philosophy of logic, philosophy of mathematics. He also says clearly, as we'll see in a moment, that we can put this in terms of meanings, but we could also put it in terms of intentions. What did you intend at this point to do later? And that will quickly, if you think about it, turn into the problematic in philosophy of action we were talking about in last class. So Kripke certainly sees that it has some generality. And Kripke also understands quite clearly, as it comes out in the second quotation, that he too takes a mathematical example. His one's a little different than this. But the point of the mathematical example isn't to make a point about mathematics. If you understand the point at the right depth, the worry is, what is it to go on in the same way? What do we mean when I say, yes, he understood that, and he kept doing it that way? He understood the rule, and it's that way he went on, which is correct. It's the same. What does it mean to say what happened before 1,000 and what happened after 1,000 is the same? Well, one thing is, you can never ask whether two things are the same. It's the point I was making here. Without some further rule specification, without some further concept to be applied. They're both the same color, the same size, the same weight, manufactured in the same print. There's got to be something. In fact, any two things are the same in some respect. And any two things are different in some respect. Certainly they're numerically distinct. So to say we're going in the same, we need to have a specification of a way in which it's the same. And as soon as we have that, we have our problem. We introduce that specification. And what is our grasp or grip on it? What is correctness or incorrectness, or accord with it? Correctness in the light of it, or accord with it. So the mathematical examples are just meant to be particularly clear that that there's this multiplicity of possible understandings that are consistent with a single performance. But they're not meant to be making a point that doesn't apply generally. Now, Kripke's example is a bit different. It's a bit complicated. But in order to see other things he says, I think we need to look at his example. His example 2 is about addition and what it is to understand addition. But he develops it slightly differently. Let me modify his example slightly, or more explicitly in a way he suggests sometimes. I don't mean to suggest this isn't in Kripke. Let's say I'm teaching someone a plus function. I'm teaching them to add. That same word I used when I said add to. But now we're not concerned with the rule just add to, but we're concerned with the even more general rule, add. Might be adding 2, might be adding another number. So we learn a lot of these things. Teaching them how to add. But this is my stipulation, just to make the example a little more vivid and tractable. Let's say all the numbers we've added until now are smaller than or equal to 57. So we just, stay, as it were, on this side of 57. So we teach them to add 45 plus 42, and so on, but examples like this. Now, then we want to get into a slightly more complicated case where things go wrong. And then we want to ask about all of these cases where we were doing this. Were we adding then? Was that person who gets into trouble later? Now it's not getting into trouble by going to 1004, but by doing something else. But we want to ask, is that person at this point someone of whom we can say, then he was adding, now he's not adding anymore? Or do we have to say, well, he was never adding. He never understood the meaning of plus. I wish I hadn't circled that, actually. The meaning of plus. And if we want to say that, then the question, and there's reason to want to say that, the question is, well, what are we saying of ourselves when we say, until now, when we've undertaken to add? We have been adding. We have been doing what we meant to do when we required of ourselves that we add the numbers. Third quotation, when he's setting out the example, he says, I, like almost all English speakers, use the word, typo, use the word plus and the symbol cross, let's call it plus 2, to denote a well-known mathematical function, addition. The function is defined for all pairs of positive integers. Now, I want to come back to these sentences at the beginning of quotation 3 later. At the end of today, we'll come back to quotation 3. Remind me to do that. But for the moment, it seems very straightforward. We appear to understand this. He's setting up his example. Then he says, by means of my external symbolic representation and my internal mental representation, I grasp the rule for addition. This is putting a very Cartesian frame on the problem. In order to stay close to Wittgenstein's text, which is also getting the problem going with, as it were, less baggage, I put it Wittgenstein's way. Wittgenstein's way is just to say, there's a sign, that just stands there like a signpost, and then we need an interpretation. Kripke puts this in terms that are more explicitly drawn from a Cartesian characterization of the gap. Doesn't make the problem any less serious, But I think Kripke's way of putting it does, as it were, force a Cartesian frame and our understanding of the problem. It doesn't, as it were, get at the most basic version of the problem. But so Kripke's way of putting it is to say, look, there's an external representation of the rule, using a sign like this, maybe words like this. And then there's my internal representation of what it means. So now we're very Cartesian. We've got these things located in two Cartesian spaces out here, marks, mental stuff, maybe one up point here, but of course, if we know our Descartes, it's not, it's not crucial thing is not to locate some bit of space between the ears, exactly 3 inches from each one, but more particularly the mind, which isn't really, mental substance is not extended, Descartes will say. That's not the kind of characteristic. It involves an understanding of meaning, an internal representation. So it's the external representation plus the internal representation. These have to yield the possibility of an accord. The right kind of combination of them, such that I can see the one is in accord with the other. What's going on with the marks is being in accord in the external representation. It's in accord with what's going on in the internal representation. Signifies what we want to call a grasp. He's grasped it. He's got the stuff out there in line with the thing we wanted him to have here. That's the very Cartesian picture of the problem. That's how Kripke's saying it up. One point is crucial, quotation 4, under the Kripke quotations, to my grasp of this rule. This is really just making explicit what came out in the Wittgenstein example. Although I myself have computed only finite many sums in the past, I made this explicit by saying no numbers were used larger than 57. No matter how many times I did this, it was a finite number. There's only so many different ways you can combine numbers to add and add them. If all the numbers themselves are under 57. Might be a lot. Again, Kato can really fill the board. Adding all the different, he can add 1 in 57, he can add 1 in 56, he can add 2 in 57. He can fill the board for a long time. But as big and busy as the board will be, it'll be a finite number of applications of the plus function. It's computed only finite many sums in the past. The rule determines my answer for indefinitely many new sums I have never previously encountered. It looks like what it is to grasp a rule is not to understand. It holds in these cases. That seems to be important as a difference between the parrot and the child. The parrot can repeat exactly what we've taught it to. The child that's learning language can go on its own and use the word in new ways and new sentences. It doesn't just repeat the ones we said. Even a very simple word like red. If I point to a couple of red things, and all you can say is point to those things and say red, then it's not really clear whether you've understood it means red. As opposed to, you're just making these noises when I confront you with these things. I can teach my dog to bark when I put those 3 things in front of it. Has my dog learned the word red? It looks like we want to say you learned red, when you can go on and see further red things. In principle, practically infinite number of red things. And say red each time. So the point doesn't have to do with the complexity of mathematics. It has to do with what it is to understand something. It looks like to be able to understand something is to understand the relationship between the meaning or the rule and its instances, such that in principle other instances could be produced. That's his point. The finite set that has already been produced can't exhaust the meaning, or we don't have a conception of meaning. But if they don't exhaust the meaning, then what do we mean by saying the next one that hasn't yet been produced is what is meant? What does that mean? That's the Kantian question in this context. So I've only computed a finite number, but my rule determines the answer for an indefinite number of new sums. This is the whole point of the notion. In learning to add, I grasp a rule. My past intentions regarding addition determine a unique answer for indefinitely many cases. He says indefinitely many, because we don't need the assumption there's an infinite number of red things, or something like that. There isn't some axiom of infinity that's required here. All that we need is, in principle, I could produce another one. And if you've understood the meaning of the word, then with respect to that new case, there should be an answer about whether it's correct or incorrect, and you should be able to say. And if you can't, or if you say something completely different than I do, that raises a version of Kripke's question. Now, to make this vivid, Kripke varies the example from Wittgenstein's example of continuing the series. But I take it that Kripke's example is just trying to bring out the point in a different way. The fundamental features of the example are the same. But one thing that's helpful about looking at two different examples is to notice how they do not have a Cartesian structure anymore. The point now is no longer... For Cartesian skepticism, we saw we had to choose our example carefully. If the bird was too many feet away, and I didn't know anything about Norwegian birds, and my eyesight was bad, and so forth, skepticism didn't follow. But here we don't need to say he goes 2, 4, 7. We can go to 1,000. We can go to 2,000. When he adds 57 to 68 in a moment, we don't need to say he got it wrong by 1. The fundamental point here, being directed to the very possibility of accord, means any mathematical example will illustrate the point just as well as any other. Because the question now is no longer to make us worried about how we can tell. And so to create two scenarios that are sufficiently similar that it's a problem of apparent indistinguishability. The problem is, what the hell would it mean for it to be right at all? Now, Kripke's example is we add 57 to 68. And just to firm up his example, I've introduced a further stipulation that we never, with Cato, this brings out the connect, by stipulating this, the connection between Wittgenstein's example and Kripke's, I think, becomes completely vivid. Because we can see this, in a sense, as an instance of continuing a series. So again, we had Cato doing plus, with all the numbers between 1 and 57. He combined them in many ways. He was starting to run out of things. And then I said, okay, Cato, do this one. There's Cato's answer. And Cato says, I've gone on in the same way as before. And Kripke, I think, purposely has chosen a case that is no longer plausible at all. He's not trying to tug at our Cartesian worries about maybe this could happen. The worry more is, in virtue of what do we rule this out? There is a function, call it quas. Kripke writes it like this. Quas rather than plus. And quas means, again, I'm slightly varying the example, just ever so slightly to make the connection clear in the stipulation. So let's say quas means whenever you add numbers between 1 and 57, you get arithmetic sums. Whenever one of those numbers is larger than 57, the function always yields 5 as its output. There are actually a lot of computer algorithms like this. When computer scientists are writing computer algorithms, they write algorithms like this all the time. You get into funny cases, and when you get into those funny cases, it takes you straight to the help problem, or it closes down. It does something that keeps the computer from crashing. Or chess machines are like this. When there's a certain kind of indefiniteness, the chess computer doesn't yield a definite result. Then the chess program has the computer do a certain kind of thing, which fits a general algorithm for all of those cases, which is basically the least dangerous move. Chess computer, if it doesn't know what to do, it tries to do nothing. So there's a lot of cases where it uses these strategic algorithms, and then there's all the other cases. In all the other cases, you do the same thing. So this function means add the numbers between 1 and 57 in this way I taught you. If I ever give you one that's larger than 57, write that. Perfectly fine function. Very clear. In some sort of way, you might say, well, that's so weird. Much harder than plus. Is it harder than plus? Say it right. Okay, two choices. Add those, and then quad those. And tell me which is harder to do. I can quad them real fast. Gives you 5. Don't feel like adding them right now, if you'll forgive me. Which is harder? Which is the harder one to grasp? Plus or plus. Hardness too. What we mean by hardness can be interpreted in more than one way. I'm not saying you can't make out another sense of hardness. So, what about when Canto filled the board for the first few hours with things like this? When Canto did all of this stuff. Was he adding or quadding? Was he doing this function until then? And then he switched to something else? Or was he all along quadding? As long as he stuck to these little numbers, it looks like adding. But maybe he was quadding. Here we have a Cartesian question. How can I tell whether he was adding or quadding? And it has a Cartesian structure, right? They're indistinguishable. It, as it were, serves the same function as the dreaming argument. From within my performance, in some ways it's more literally like the other mind's argument. From the outside, what he does is the same. But maybe there's pain inside or not. On the outside, what he does is the same. He produces this stuff. But in the inside, does the little light bulb of the mind mean to be doing this or that? I can't get at it. I can only get at the performance. The mind is, I can't get at the mind. Which is it? I can't tell. It looks the same whether he's adding or quadding. Same behaviors. It's a Cartesian structure. It's another one of these indistinguishability arguments. With the conclusion, there is no way to know, or there is no way to tell. That initially looks like the problem. Many people read Kripke as if that were the whole problem. Kripke were just making this Cartesian skeptical point. Much as Kripke has written to encourage you to read it that way, it's not just their fault. The conclusion of quotation 6 is, who is to say this is not the function I previously meant by plus? Is this the function I meant or not? That leaves in place the idea, there is something which is meaning plus. There is something which is my performance as being in accord with plus, but how do I tell? It's a Cartesian question, that last question at the end of 6. But as Kripke goes on to say, no matter how I try to answer that, the skeptic will always be able to say that I might be misinterpreting. This is exactly now the kind of question we had about the sign, or all the other Cartesian philosophy language questions. Another interpretation is possible, as I always put it. I might be misinterpreting. And it was quadding I was doing. How do I know when I was looking at these things that look so much like adding? That I wasn't, as it were, imposing my interpretation of adding on them, as I did when I imposed my interpretation of traffic law onto the, as it were, facts of the British road and almost got killed. Looks just like what we folks do when we add. There are cultures, purportedly in parts of Africa, where they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, many. And they add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, everything else is many. This culture's got all the way to 57. And then they just stick with this. This isn't exactly many, it's a little stranger. Now, these examples, Kripke says, apply throughout language, are not confined to mathematical examples. Though it's with mathematical examples they can be brought out most smoothly. A word like table, he says, is something that has indefinitely many uses. How do I know that someone has understood it? What am I saying? Am I just saying, he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this? That doesn't give us anything that can fill out a notion of understanding. It's got to be that he knows how to go on in the right way. That's what it means to say his table. We need an idea of possible performances which relate to his actual performances as they would on our understanding of the word. There's some notion of modality built into the very idea of meaning. Normativity can't simply be exhausted by a set of facts. But then the same questions can come up about table that can come up here. And indeed, when you teach little children this, you do run into this kind of thing. Cavell has the example in the Cavell reading you did of the little kid who says, kitty, 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 very nicely. And then she goes up to this lovely fur coat and pats it and says, kitty. And you realize, she wasn't doing as well as you thought with all those other kitties. she was going out in the same way. She saw a connection, but it only appeared to be mimicking an understanding of Kitty. Now, back to plus and quas. Is this a Cartesian or a Kantian question? In much of the book, much of the article, which is incorporated then into the book, what Kripke does is he alternates between two ways of putting it. He keeps giving examples and saying, there's no way to tell in this case whether he's adding or quadding. That is, there's no fact of the matter about whether it's addition or quaddition he means. The that is suggests that the second clause is just a rephrasing of the first clause. But the first clause is stating a Cartesian problem. The second clause is stating a Kantian problem. And there's a lot of this in the Kripke, which then makes it very unclear what the issue is. I think part of the reason for that is his initial setup of the problem, in ways I tried to show you, is extremely Cartesian. And I think it's partly because his sense, like the sense of many philosophers, is for it to be skepticism, it has to have this shape of a Cartesian problem. You know, how can we distinguish? We can't distinguish. We can't tell. Wittgenstein thinks of it as skepticism. We're trying to get it to be a skeptical problem. So he set it up that way. But Kripke also understands it well enough that he's seeing that the real problem is this other shape. So he puts it both ways, both to make it feel like skepticism and to bring out the deeper problem. But in the preface, in the early part of the book, on page 21, as he'd been thinking about this longer, I think it became quite clear to him that the one therein is just a root to the other. He shouldn't see these as appositions. You should see the first way of putting it as a setup for a problem which, once you think through, takes the second form. So I think if he really rewrote the whole book carefully, as we get later into the book, the Cartesian formulations would drop away. They wouldn't keep cropping up again. But patience sitting down and writing things has not ever been Kripke's great strength. So let's look at quotation 9. Let's return to our example of plus and quas. We've just summarized the problems in terms of the basis of my present particular response. What tells me that I should say 125 and not 5? Now that looks like a Cartesian problem. What tells me? How can I know? Of course, the problem can be put equivalently in terms of the skeptical query regarding my present intent. This is one of these places where I said he's very good at seeing that there's a philosophy of action variant about this. Right now I said this. How do I know later that my action is what I intended? Something happened. In the causal order, I did one thing, it brought about the other. Synapses fired. I did something. What does it mean to say, but when I did, fits my intention, my earlier intention? How do I know whether it fit my earlier intention? So formulated, the problem may appear to be epistemological. How can anyone know? This emphasis on know goes with that my emphasis on know here goes with the emphasis on knowledge and know. Section 3 of Mind and World. It's the introduction we looked at last time. How can anyone know which of these I meant? But he goes on. So it looks, you might think it's an epistemological problem if you put it that way. Given, however, that everything in my mental history is compatible both with the conclusion that I meant plus and with the conclusion that I meant quas, there's still a bit of a Cartesian frame here. There's some sort of picture of a physical history on that side of the Cartesian gap and a mental history on this side of the Cartesian gap. There's things I intend, whatever those are. I intend to do this, no, I intend to do that. But he wants to say whatever the layout of these two places are, the physical one and the mental one, it's compatible both with the conclusion that I meant plus and with the conclusion that I meant quas. Given that's compatible with either of these, it's clear that the skeptical challenge is not really an epistemological one. It purports to show that nothing in my history of past behavior, nothing in my mental history of past behavior could establish whether I meant plus or quas. No matter what I did. It's not a Cartesian case where I couldn't tell at this distance whether it was a tomato or not. No matter how close I got, no matter how long I looked at it, no matter how long I bounced and sunk my teeth into it, no matter how close, how much of a view I have of the history of my performance, nothing could count. It's whether I meant plus or quas. And then he tries to bring that out in a very Cartesian way with the bit I skipped between the dashes. Not even an omniscient God would know. So say there's this omniscient God who can see he can see everything. He can see the numbers Cato wrote. He can see the ones that Cato erased. He can see all the way into Cato's mind. He can see everything. He can see more than we can. The thought is, no matter how many facts you could see, facts here, facts there, looks like we have a problem where any accumulation of these facts still doesn't take away the problem. That it's not clear what accord consists in. That is, all of this could be consistent with an indefinite number of possible understandings of what is meant. If it's under 57 quos, but we can create another function, schmus, to make you want the numbers a little bigger. I'm not going to take questions. I'm out of time. I'm just going to say two more things. So Kripke goes on, but then it appears to follow that there was no fact about me that constituted my having meant plus rather than quos. How could there be? There was no such thing as my meaning this rather than that in the past. There can be no such thing in the present. What was initially presented, the paradox, we perforce used language, taking present meanings for granted. Go back to quotation 3 of the Kripke. Quotation 3 of the Kripke. I, like almost all English speakers, use the word plus and so forth. Read that. And many other words after that. Here we're assuming our ability to come to shared understandings of words simply in virtue of using them. But if we think ourselves all the way through to the Kantian version of the problematic, we've raised the question about what we're doing even then. And to set up the problem, we must take our ability to understand language for granted. So we initially put it as a Cartesian problem. Not a problem about we could so much as mean something. We're taking our ability to mean things for granted and asking whether it's this or that we mean. Do we mean 1004 or 1002? And we said add 2 at this point. But once we think it through, it engulfs the very capacities we're exercising in setting up the problem. This is another feature of Kantian skepticism, which is at the end of those list of features. That Kantian skepticism calls into question the very capacities it presupposes. That's true every time. It's part of why it's not a doubt. We no longer have a doubt about what we mean. To raise a doubt about what we mean presupposes that I mean something in raising the doubt. Hence, boggle about, now how do you want to put the boggle? Any way you put the boggle is itself, as it were, an expression of your helplessness with respect to the problem. The boggle itself isn't something that can be clearly presented. It's a sort of philosophical conclusion you seem to be pushed towards, but you can't completely embrace. Because to embrace it requires your capacity to come to a determinate conclusion of a sort that is itself being placed into question. This is, I think, connected to what Kripke is saying in quotation 11, which I won't read through here, when he's trying to defend Wittgenstein his own way for having written. I don't think this is a very good or full account of why Wittgenstein writes the way he does. But Kripke's saying, look, if you really understand how deep this problem is, there isn't something which results here which is a view about the nature of meaning. To have a view about the nature of meaning means being able to produce sentences like the ones we have in quotation 3, which stand still. To see how deep this problem is to see that the words we use to motivate the problem themselves, retrospectively, seem to be placed under a certain indictment. So, as he puts it, at the end of quotation 10 now, when we initially presented the paradox, we perforce used language, taking present meanings for granted. Now we see that this provisional concession was indeed fictive. There can be no facts as to what I meant by plus or any other word at any time, including when I set it up in quotation 3. The latter must finally be kicked away. That's a reference to Wittgenstein's Tractatus, but the idea that the very formulation you have in such Kantian problems, I think this is itself, right to think the Tractatus itself is a Kantian problematic. That whenever you have a Kantian problematic, it has the form of a ladder you kick away. That is, you present a certain problem, but once you come to see the depth of the problem at the end, there's a question about how the sentences you used to reach the conclusion you appear to have at the end could even mean what they do. You have a problem of the conclusion seeming to render the sentences you uttered nonsense, But if the sentences were nonsense, then you don't have that conclusion, but it's not clear how you avoid it. Kripke's trying to use the word paradox, taking it from Wittgenstein to bring this out. It's not a problem. It's something that you can't actually get into focus. It's worse than a paradox. This, then, is our skeptical paradox, he says. I will stop there for now. So we will continue with Kripke a bit more beginning next time, and we'll bring in Cavell's criticism of Kripke and see how what Cavell's doing relates to Kripke. I will draw a bit on the claim of reason as well, which Cato talked about last Monday, but if you haven't looked at that at all, you might want to.